It's my great pleasure to welcome everybody here this afternoon. Although few in number, I guess it's shopping beckons and the sun is shining. But you're here, and that's wonderful. Thank you, and welcome also to those who are joining us via Zoom. As I mentioned yesterday, that when it comes to I just ask you to remain muted while Grace is doing her talk, and at the end, if you have questions, please feel free to unmute yourself so that we can hear your questions in the Q&A. Is there a Q&A? Not really. Time for response. Perfect. Well, those of you who were here yesterday, I think everybody except for Karen was here yesterday. I think you, and Ruth, you weren't here, but you have met Grace before. Because I was going to I'll invite Ant to come up and do a brief introduction before I hand it over to Grace. And thank you so much again for being with us.
Good afternoon, everyone, and good afternoon to those of you online. It's my very great pleasure to welcome Grace here to do one of our Thomas and Winifred Nisbet lectures. It's been a long time since we've done them, and it's a really important part of our Bermudian life because we don't get many opportunities to engage in theological thought at this sort of level, to have folk coming over. It's always a real privilege. But when I spoke to Grace, when I went over and visited St. Mellitus College, I realized that in Grace was someone who could really help us and really communicate in a language that we can understand. Now, those who came to her lecture yesterday realized she's also fabulously clever because we heard about her doctorate. Today, she's going to be speaking on something that I think we can all engage with. We recognize the mess in all our lives, and we all love the story of Ruth in the scriptures. So do welcome Grace, and if you're at home, I invite you also to applaud. It'll do you good as well as Grace, and we can welcome her now together to the stage. She's from London, but she'll tell you all about herself if she needs to. But it's my pleasure to welcome Grace Bally. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Bishop Nick and Canon Ant. Yeah, it's wonderful to be here again, day 2, with you. And as Canon Ant has explained, I'm going to be looking at the book of Ruth through the title, Great Love During Times of Great Mess. I'm hoping as well that we will have a time of Bible study. So I'm looking at this as Bible study. If you do have a Bible, that would be great, whether on your phones or a paper copy. We are going to be dipping in and out of the scriptures. I just want to check, first of all, with a show of hands, if anybody has read the book of Ruth. Who's read the book of Ruth? Oh, awesome, everybody. That makes it easier. Lovely, lovely. And what a wonderful story, isn't it? A beautiful, beautiful story. And you know, many readers liken the book of Ruth to a love story. I think that I can see many aspects of Ruth that is typically a wonderful romantic tale. There are many women who will say, I need to find my Boaz. It is a wonderful story. A young woman meets man, older man meets woman. Her attentions flatter his heart. And so he is overcome by love. Isn't that beautiful? It reminds me of Pride and Prejudice, Mr. Darcy, the BBC adaptation. Mr. Darcy is emerging from the lake, and the rest is history. But it's beautiful, it's wonderful. Boaz makes his striking entrance in the book of Ruth as the kinsman redeemer. We're going to look at that, what the kinsman redeemer entailed. But he comes in and he not only saves Ruth out of poverty and obscurity, he also gives Naomi, who is broken. She's gone through tough times, destitution. he gives her hope through the birth of Obed. And we're going to look at that as well. So this title, the great love in times of great mess, they're coming from messy situations. And I'm sure that we can identify as people who have gone through messy and difficult situations. So I want you to be reflecting through those eyes, through those lenses as we go into the story. But this is just not any love story. This is God's love story. That's what I love again about the book of Ruth. Everything in the book talks about the beauty and the nature of God. It talks about his sovereignty. It talks about his faithfulness. It talks about him as a redeemer, and it talks about his love. In the book, it is one of the most famous love narratives, but in the book, it holds great significance. It has multiple themes and subplots. Thank you. So the book is set right after the book of Judges in the Old Testament. So the book of Ruth comes straight after the book of Judges in the Old Testament, and the story takes place during the time of the Judges. So you know, in the book of Judges, we start off with Israel and Joshua, and then after Joshua, there is a series of judges. So the dating of this book is around 950 to 1150 BC. Now, the authorship of Ruth is unknown, but Jewish tradition ascribes the book to the prophet Samuel. And recently, many biblical scholars have adopted the traditional view of Ruth, accepting that it is historically trustworthy work of one writer. So we believe that it is Samuel, Prophet Samuel, and he was the sole writer. Ruth was not even an Israelite. And when you think about the book of Ruth, it's very unusual for the book to be entitled Ruth. It's the only book in the canon, our Bible, that is named after a non-Israelite. That is unusual. But that speaks about the significance of the work or the contributions that Ruth did to the history of Israel. And so she is a Moabitess, a neighboring country for Israel. And it's believed that the story presupposes the genealogy. The genealogy in Ruth and in Chronicles probably came from a common temple source. That's what scholars believe. They also the scholars argue that it is unlikely that David would have been linked to a Moabite ancestress unless he was in fact her descendant. So basically, the genealogy that we see in Chronicles and Ruth is held as very strong and very true, basically. So the story opens up with Elimelech. Elimelech is Naomi's husband, and his family, they move from Bethlehem to Moab. And I've tried to show it in the map. Basically, Moab is on the opposite of I think it's the Galilee Sea, I'm not sure, can't remember. But what's Dead Sea, thank you. On the other side of the Dead Sea from Bethlehem. Next slide. Oh, it's working. So what is the theme that runs through the story of Ruth? Well, first of all, the overarching theme is love, God's love. We see God's love demonstrated throughout every verse, throughout every chapter. But we also see the theme of faithfulness running through the book. Naomi demonstrates faithfulness by returning to the land of promise. 10 years they spend as a family, Naomi, her husband Elimelech, and their 2 sons in Moab. But then they return when they hear that things have improved. There was a famine for such a long time, but her faithfulness sees her returning to the land of promise. And Ruth demonstrates her faithfulness by accompanying the family, by accompanying Ruth back to Israel, back to Bethlehem. She didn't have to, because her husband had died. There was no more a link or a tie connecting her with Naomi. She had no children for her husband to stay loyal, but yet we see loyalty in Ruth. Boaz demonstrates his faithfulness by fulfilling his covenant role as the near kinsman, the one who would save them out of this destitution. And above all, Ruth is the story of God's faithfulness, which is compelled by love. What a great love. In the next slide, I show the sub-themes. So these are the key themes that are emerging out of the book. We can call them theological themes, we can call them theological reflections. But the fact is that Ruth and Naomi's worlds are about to be turned upside down. They are about to go through grief, loss, instability, displacement, and also upheaval. And you'll see, as I explain, the cultural setting was really, really harsh for them. We see then in this time the theme of famine and migration. Famine, there was famine in Israel, and they migrated to this land of Moab, living in a different culture. Ruth, when she comes back to Bethlehem, has to live amongst the people that she does not know, amongst a religion that she does not have. And even in terms of the biblical law, she wasn't really someone who had any rights, but yet we see this theme of living in a different culture. And it reminds me today of those who are experiencing migration. They're running away from hardship in their countries. They're fleeing their countries. Recently in the news in the UK, we had a number of migrants who tried to come from France to the UK shores, and I think many of them died. And so people are fleeing, not because they want to have a good time, but because they're coming away from pain and difficult times, so desperate that they put their lives at stake. Another theme is marriage across faiths and cultures. And we see that with Ruth, who takes a step of faith in doing this, marrying into a culture that is not hers, knowing that she might be treated really harshly. And then God's sovereignty, the overarching theme, the providence that comes out of this, that even in times of mess, even in times of difficulty, God provides, God makes a way. And not only does he do that, he does it and brings everything together. It's part of his master plan. And of course, redemption. The fact that Boaz is a redeemer to this family is a picture of God as our redeemer, who redeems us, not just from difficulties, not just from our weaknesses, but also from situations that might engulf us. And I wonder if you can think about the last 18 months or so with the COVID season, the difficulties that we've gone through, the upheavals that we've experienced, the mess that's come out of that. yet God was there all the time to see us through. In the next slide, we will look at famine and migration as a theme. So I'm just going to read for you, and if you read along with me, Ruth chapter 1, and we're going to go from 1 to 10. Now it came to pass in the days when the judges ruled that there was a famine in the land, and a certain man of Bethlehem, Judah, went to dwell in the country of Moab, he and his wife and his 2 sons. The name of the man was Elimelech. The name of his wife was Naomi, and the names of his 2 sons were Mahlon and Chilion, Ephrathites of Bethlehem, Judah. And they went to the country of Moab and remained there. Then Elimelech, Naomi's husband, died, and she was left and her 2 sons. Now they took wives of the women of Moab. The name of one was, I always say Oprah, but it's not Oprah. Orpah. Oprah, what are you doing in the Bible? And the name of the other, Ruth. And they dwelt there about 10 years. Then both Mahlon and Chilion also died. So the woman survived her 2 sons and her husband. Then she arose with her daughters-in-law that she might return from the country of Moab, for she had heard in the country of Moab that the Lord had visited his people by giving them bread. Therefore she went out from the place where she was, and her 2 daughters-in-law with her. And they went on the way to return to the land of Judah. And Naomi said to her 2 daughters-in-law, "Go, return each to her mother's house. The Lord deal kindly with you as you have dealt with the dead and with me. The Lord grant that you may find rest, each in the house of her husband." So she kissed them, and they lifted up their voices and wept. And they said to her, "Surely we will return with you to your people." Naomi tells her daughter-in-laws 3 times to return, verses 8, 11 to 12. "Why remain with me? I have nothing to offer you. Go, get on with your life. You have no children, so there is no tie. You can get married again." And as the story goes, Ruth says no and cleaves to Naomi. She holds on to her. Ruth trusts in the God of Israel. And even in the mess that Naomi is experiencing, even in the pain and the grief, can you imagine losing your husband and 2 sons? It's unimaginable. She was totally bitter. And even in that, Naomi was a blessing to Ruth. Naomi could not see that God's hand was even there in the mess. But in the mess, Naomi's life was speaking volumes to Ruth. I mean, I've had a mother-in-law, and come on, mother-in-laws are not easy. They're not easy. Sometimes they can be a blessing, so I've got to be really careful here because most women here might be mother-in-laws. But mother-in-laws can sometimes really be difficult. And the last thing you're going to want to do in my books is hang on to your mother-in-law and follow her wherever she goes. Come on, get a life. But no, there was something in Naomi that Ruth said, I want to cling to that. I'm going to hold on, and I'm going to, through you, be blessed. And so she's blessing the God of Israel in verse 12. She's trusting in the God of Israel. And not only this, Ruth confesses her love for her mother-in-law and her faith in God and her decision to worship him alone, verses 16 to 17. And in spite of the bad example from her disobedient in-laws, this is Ruth looking at the in-laws in the fact that they had left Bethlehem, Ruth wanted to be with God's people and dwell in his land. Now, there is a verse in their law that says they weren't supposed to go to or mingle with Moabites. And yet, Elimelech had picked up his family to do this. And when you think of it, maybe they should have stayed and supported that community in a time of famine. So there was also that going on in the mind of Naomi. Am I going through this pain because of the things that we did as a family? But there was a divine law also that said, an Amorite or Moabite shall not enter the assembly of the law of the Lord, Deuteronomy 23, verse 3. So when Naomi, some scholars say that when Naomi was saying to her daughters-in-law, stay here, she could have been saying that because in the eyes of the faith, the Jewish faith, they had broken the law by intermarrying Moabitesses. Ruth was dependent on God's mercy. She had to trust God's grace. The law excludes us from God's mercy, but it is grace that includes us if we put our faith in Christ. Amen. The only way that unbelievers or those who have erred from God's ways can be saved is by grace. I'm going to quickly read verse 19, and it says this. Now the two of them went until they came to Bethlehem, and it happened when they had come to Bethlehem that all the city was excited because of them, and the women said, "Is this Naomi?" But she said to them, "Do not call me Naomi, call me Mara." Now Naomi means in Hebrew, sweet, and Mara means bitter. Call me Mara, for the Almighty has dealt very bitterly with me. I went out full, and the Lord has brought me home again empty. Why do you call me Naomi, since the Lord has testified against me? The Almighty has afflicted me. You know, sometimes when we go through stuff, we think that God is not hearing our prayers, that he's turned his back on us. But that's not the case. You know, his timing is not always our timing. He wants us to just wait, trust him, and we will see him come through for us. And so their question to Naomi, the women, their question to her is this. Naomi suggests both surprise and bewilderment. It suggests that Naomi had really changed, maybe physically on her face, showing the pain that she had gone through. It's one thing to know God's name, but it's another thing to trust him. By the time they get, yes, I've said that, haven't I? By the time they arrive in Bethlehem, it is the beginning of the Bally season, so the end of that chapter. This is also suggesting the barley season, new beginnings, hope. That's a sound effect. New beginnings and hope. Something is about to change for Naomi and Ruth. Next slide, please. And just to set the context again about the hardship. So maybe, Ant, if you can just reveal all the text on that one. So in this time, ancient Near Eastern culture, to be widowed meant a woman would be without security. So Naomi is actually going back very empty-handed. She has nothing now, even though she has land, even though she has possessions back in Bethlehem. No one to provide for her food and shelter or protect her from physical harm. In the case of Ruth, everything within her and around her presented obstacles to her faith, and yet she trusted the God of Israel. Her background was against her, as we know, for she was from Moab, where they worshipped the god Chemosh, who accepted human sacrifices and encouraged immorality. So even Naomi was against her, for she urged her to return. But as we know, Ruth stuck by her. Next slide, please. So I have a reflection question. Obviously, we can't get into groups because of COVID, but would you, for a moment, just consider the first question, if you just ponder that on your own? When trouble comes to our lives, we can either endure it or escape it. Just have a think about that. What would be your response, or what has been your response lately? Where trouble came, what was your response? Did you endure it? Did you escape it? And after you've done that, number two, what experience have you had in starting over as Ruth and Naomi did? So let's just ponder that for a second. Go to the next slide. So in chapter 2, this is the meeting of Boaz, where Ruth meets Boaz. Verse 1 says this: there was a relative of Naomi's husband, a man of great wealth, of the family of Elimelech. His name was Boaz. So Ruth the Moabitess said to Naomi, please let me go to the field and glean heads of grain after him, in whose sight I may find favor. And she said to her, go, my daughter. So in verse 2, Ruth sets out to get food so that they could eat. And she's going out as a step of faith, because again, remember, she's a Moabitess. So she's like right at the bottom of the social ladder. And based on the commandments, after a harvest was reaped, gleanings, that is the leftovers of the grain that fell to the floor, would be left for the poor or for the aliens, not the UFO aliens, but the aliens or the stranger, the ones who did not, they weren't indigenous to the land. And that's the way the poor would eat. Ruth was looking for grace. she was looking for favor because Ruth and Naomi were hungry. And as a woman, a poor widow, and a stranger, Ruth had no claims on anything. It's amazing that Naomi was bitter with God, but Ruth was willing for God to have his way with her in her life. So we see God beginning to do this gracious work through Ruth. Verse 3, Boaz means in him is strength. In him is strength. We can go to bring up all the lines on this one, please. Yeah, so Boaz means in him is strength. And it wasn't a coincidence that Ruth is gleaming in Boaz's garden or his field. That is the providence of God working out. It's amazing. And as Ruth is in the field, picking up the leftovers, Boaz sets his eyes on her and says, "Oh, hey up. Who is that?" He catches a glimpse of Ruth and he extends his kindness and favor. And he even says to his workers to watch out for Ruth when she comes, look after her. In fact, give her more of the leftovers. Fill her apron with all those leftovers. Make sure you take care of her. And we see that Boaz starts to show affection. He starts to show concern because he knows that she is a woman on her own and he wants to make sure that she's protected. He even tells her to walk with the female workers who followed immediately after the reapers. And after Ruth has eaten, the food she has collected is enough to last her and Naomi for a week, which is amazing. And at this point, Naomi is excited and she blesses her benefactor and the Lord, verses 19 to 20, which says this, "And her mother-in-law said to her, 'Where have you gleaned today? And where did you work? Blessed be the one who took notice of you.' So she told her mother-in-law with whom she had worked and said, 'The man's name with whom I work today is Boaz.' Then Naomi said to her daughter-in-law, 'Blessed be he of the Lord who has not forsaken his kindness to the living and the dead.' And Naomi said to her, 'This man is a relation of ours, one of our close relatives.'" Naomi calls Ruth blessed. She's hopeful, very hopeful, when she learns that it is Boaz that has provided Ruth with these gleanings or allowed her to take these gleanings, because she knows that he is related, he's wealthy, and he's influential. And Naomi's mind starts to tick away and overwork. And when we get to chapter 3, she's advising her what to do in the presence of Boaz. You know, we too must have hope. We must have hope in God. And now the God of hope fill you. Romans 15:13 says this. "Now the God of hope fill you with all joy and peace in believing, that ye may abound in hope through the power of the Holy Ghost." The exciting new hope for the two widows was centered in a person. And our hope is centered in Jesus Christ. Naomi had hope because Boaz was a near kinsman. And she also had hope because of what Boaz had done. And we see in this chapter the introduction of the term kinsman redeemer, verse 20. Other translations say near kinsman or kinsman or near kinsman. But we will talk about what that is exactly shortly. And so Ruth's labor in the barley harvest, which was around March and April, and the wheat harvest, which is around June and July, is a metaphor, it's a picture of anticipating the day of redemption. Let's move to the next slide. Oh, brilliant. So I have another question for you. How can we become channels of grace to others? Boaz was a channel of grace. How can we become channels of grace in our church, in our communities, in our homes, in our families? How can we become a channel of God's grace? Let's just ponder on that and reflect for a moment. I think there is a song that says, "Make me a channel of your peace." How can we become channels of God's grace, forgiveness, unmerited favor? Next slide. Boaz is falling for Ruth. So here are just some verses providing some evidence of the development of their relationship. He calls her my daughter because she was younger. And it's also a term of endearment. He goes above and beyond. I talked about what he does with talking to the servants, how to look after her. And he gives her so much, the best of the gleanings. And he eats with her and personally hands her the food. Isn't that lovely? I think it's so romantic. I think it's romantic. And he asks Ruth to stay close to his servants and to stay in his field. Don't go to anybody else's field. Stay in my field and do your gleanings, do the gleanings. What a wonderful analogy we see of God's great love for us. God loves us no matter who we are, no matter where we've come from, no matter what our background is. His love is so unconditional, and he is our provider. And God is generous towards us, just as we see in the picture of Boaz being generous to Ruth. A wonderful picture of God's grace. So in the next slide, I talk about two things, two key words. You know, this story provides a transition. The background provides a transition of the patriarchs. So Abraham, Jacob, the patriarchs, they are the patriarchs. We see a transition of the patriarchs to the monarchy. The genealogy at the end of the book traces the lineage of Boaz from Perez, the son of Judah, down to King David. And for many Israelites, the most important part of this book is the very last chapter, which talks about David. And the story of Ruth shows how God's sovereignty, though almost imperceptibly, achieves his purposes through the faithfulness of his people. God uses us to bring about his promises. There are two words, if you can bring that up, please, that are in relation to God's promises, to God's providence. And the first one is kindness, hesed. The Hebrew word hesed is about covenant faithfulness. And it occurs in this book 3 times in the prayers and commendations spoken by the characters. God rewards the faithfulness of his people. That is the kindness of God. And God's undivided love is at work here, taking Ruth and Naomi out of a great mess. His love, his great love, the hesed of his love, the kindness of his love, the faithfulness of his love draws us out of that great mess. And then the kinsman redeemer, Goel, is the Hebrew for this word. Boaz, kinsman redeemer, refers to a relative who helped out a troubled family so that that family was not dispossessed. They will not be dispossessed of the land or left without an heir. This is the real key thing here. As kinsman redeemer, Boaz could redeem the family property that Elimelech had probably left behind or mortgaged when he took his family to Moab. And this is speculation because it doesn't actually say that. But that's the power that he had as a kinsman redeemer. And so they had to find somebody in Naomi's family as kinsman redeemer to give Naomi and Ruth a status again. The wife of the deceased went with the property. So in the case of Ruth, if there was property, the kinsman redeemer would not only have the property, but he would have Ruth. And so Ruth approaches Boaz under the guidance and instruction of Naomi for him to be her kinsman redeemer. But Boaz, knowing that there was a pecking order, says to her, actually, I can't be the kinsman redeemer because there's somebody before me that by right is the kinsman redeemer. He will have to marry you or want to marry you. That choice has to go to him. If he says no, I'm definitely interested. So can you see what God is doing? God has built up this lovely romance, this lovely, beautiful, natural relationship along the way, and God works things out. Mm-hmm. So the kinsman redeemer would inherit the property and the family name, and family possessions would continue to be heirs. We now see by the end of this chapter that Naomi's bitterness has turned to joy. It's turned to gratitude. It's turned to sweetness. And her unbelief in her faith has reverted, it's turned around again into hope in God. She now sees that God is really at work. God, you were always there. You never left me. You were always in the background, taking care of me. Next slide, please. Okay, so I'm going to read some verses again. So under the instruction of Naomi, verse 1, then Naomi, her mother-in-law, said to her, my daughter, shall I not seek security for you, that it may be well with you? Now Boaz, whose young women you were with, is he not our relative? In fact, he is winnowing barley tonight at the threshing floor. Therefore, wash yourself and anoint yourself. Put on your best garment and go down to the threshing floor. But do not make yourself known to the man until he has finished eating and drinking. Then it shall be when he lies down that you shall notice the place where he lies. And you shall go in, uncover his feet, and lie down, and he will tell you what you should do. And she said to her, all that you say to me, I will do. So we see a drastic change in Ruth ever since Boaz came into her life. Naomi is now a different person. Her concern is no longer about herself and her grief, but her concern is about Ruth and her future. There should be a drastic change when God comes into our life. And in the steps that Ruth takes, recorded in this chapter, we see the steps that God's people must take if they want to enter into a deeper relationship with the Lord. Like Ruth, we must not be satisfied merely with living on leftovers or even receiving gifts. We must want God for who he is. We must want him for when we have him, we also have all that he owns. And so the whole process that she goes through of cleaning up, washing herself, it's like what happens when we come to Christ, then the new birth, that we are clean before him. We've been washed in the blood of the Lamb. And it's such a beautiful picture of relationship with us and with God. And in the next slide, the final chapter, I believe. No. Oh, I've got a question. Have we got time for a question? Okay. So why can't we come into God's presence clothed in our own righteousness? What do we need instead? Can anyone answer that for me? I know we've got scholars in the room. Why can't we come into God's presence clothed in our own righteousness? And what do we need instead?
Because our own righteousness is as filthy rags.
Lovely. Direct from the Bible itself. We are like filthy rags, absolutely. Anyone else want to add to that? What do we mean by filthy rags?
That we don't live up to God's righteousness is way above us, and so our filthy rags is our sin.
I just about hear you under that mask.
It's our rebellion and our sin against God is our filthy rags.
Absolutely. So what a metaphor for our sins. They are like, they're filthy because he's holy and therefore we are not holy. Anyone else? What do we need instead?
To acknowledge that our righteousness is flawed.
To acknowledge that our righteousness is flawed. And when we acknowledge that our righteousness is flawed, what is our response, or what can be our response?
Humility before God. Humility.
Humility before God, yes. Humility before God. Anyone else? Seeking forgiveness, absolutely. And how does God give us assurance today? When we are going through the times of mess, when we are going through the times of challenges and difficulties, what do we know from our experience of God that he's there with us? How does he give us assurance?
His word.
His word, absolutely, yes. The Bible, we read the scriptures. That gives us assurance. It tells us who he is. Anything else? By praying to him and waiting upon him. And I think I'll take one more.
Medical breakthroughs.
Medical breakthroughs. Yes. Medical breakthroughs as in healing. Is that what you mean? Healing, miracles, vaccinations, providence, God's providence, right? So he makes a way. He makes a way. It can either be supernatural, it can be physical, it can be things that we do in our world. God uses those things. And there was one at the back.
Well, he repaired and restored broken relationships.
Can you just take that down?
He can restore broken relationships.
Restoration. So we see God at work. We see him at work in restoring relationships, restoring the earth. Yes, absolutely. And the last one, I think you said something. Yeah. Did you say something? You forgot it? Okay. Done? Fellowship. Thank you for saying that word, fellowship. So important. The church, meeting each other in groups, when we come together in community. Community is my favorite word at the moment, as you might have guessed yesterday. Community, God can reveal himself through us in community. And that's how we can also know the assurance of God. Wonderful, excellent. So we've got 8 minutes left. So in the last chapter, to cut a short story short, Boaz becomes the kinsman redeemer. He saves the day, he marries Ruth. Naomi's joy is full because out of that union, a child, a baby is born, Obed. So we see this story unfolding before our very eyes. There's something that started as a mess becomes hope because of God's great love, because God was always there, and because he just needed that one person who had faith to trust him, to see him outwork his promises in the lives of this family. And this special baby, Obed, not only was a blessing to Boaz, Ruth, and Naomi, but out of the line of Obed, David would be born. Yeah, from the line of Jesse linked to Obed. I think Obed was the grandfather of Jesse. I might be wrong. But something even more significant, out of the line of David, I'm going to throw it out there, who would be born? Jesus. Our bishop said Jesus. Yeah. Jesus. So we see Jesus' lineage coming through Ruth and Naomi, the importance of us being faithful to allow God to do what he wants to do. And so finally, my last slide, I believe, is what we can learn from this wonderful, wonderful story. So Ruth would influence Naomi, and then God would bring to pass a wonderful work that would eventually bring the Son of God into the world. Promised to Abraham that his seed would bring blessing to the whole world. Genesis 12, verses 1-3, the promise given to Abraham. But we also learned within this great biblical account the following: God shows providence to those who trust in him. Not only does God give Ruth a new husband, but he also positioned her to become the great grandmother of King David, and in so doing, added her to the very lineage of Jesus Christ. Ruth would have had no idea what was going to happen with her amazing future. And secondly, Ruth is totally committed to Naomi. As we saw, Naomi becomes committed to Ruth. Boaz commits to Ruth. And as followers of Christ, God wants us to become people who are connected to trusting in his character and promises that requires our faith. And thirdly, Ruth trusts in Naomi's God. We must abide in Jesus Christ and trust in him. Trust in him with faith, hope, and love. Trust God for your new beginning. And then finally, Ruth submits to God. This is relationship. She anticipates her redemption, gleaning in the field for months. Naomi learns to submit to God. Remember that she started out bitter, Mara, and again her sweetness returns as she submits to God. And that's relationship, another favorite word of mine at the moment. And it's when we serve others that we see ourselves receive the greatest joy and satisfaction. And it shows us a picture of Christ's relationship to those who trust him and belong to him. This all speaks of God's faithfulness. Thank you. I wondered if there was any comments? Any contributions? Yes. Would you like to come to the mic in the middle? Wonderful. Thank you.
I'm supposed to take the top of the microphone. Hi, Grace. Thank you. My name is Terry Housel, Reverend Terry Housel, and I want to thank you for just walking us through this beautiful love story and story of redemption. Just as a matter of reflection, for me, there are so many so many other themes as well that run through this story. But it was something that you said that made me reflect on Naomi's bitterness and Ruth's joy, and how perhaps Naomi, and it allowed me to align it with old faith versus new faith, or old salvation versus new salvation. And what I mean by that is how Naomi perhaps was in a space where, as a Israelite, coming from Israel, going to Moab with her husband, and perhaps finding themselves in a space where they may have violated some of God's laws, and how we sometimes in our spiritual journeys do things that are contrary to what God would want us to do. And as a result of that, we become, as a result of the consequences of some of the decisions that we make, we end up becoming bitter, and we feel as if God has turned God's back on us, and we feel ourselves disaligned with God. And hence we become bitter. And then Ruth now represents a Moab who's now going to, I will serve your God. And so it's a new relationship with the God that she's foreign to, but that there's some level of joy that she has and excitement where she's now, I will pursue and do whatever is required, which now helps Naomi to come back to a place of recognizing God's goodness, God's grace, and God's forgiveness. And we end up with a story where, we all live happily ever after, so to speak, in terms of, but Naomi's faith is restored and renewed as a result of her relationship with Ruth and Ruth's new relationship with God, new salvation. So it reminds me sometimes of how, if we've been in the trenches for years, following God, doing God's thing, and sometimes we become disillusioned and feel like God is not in our presence. And then someone who just joins the faith comes along and is all excited, and they say things that sometimes you're like, but it brings us back to a place of realizing just how good God is and how wonderful God is. And so that's one of the themes that I picked up today, that there's the old salvation comes into a place of feeling neglected, disillusioned. New salvation brings joy and excitement, and in the end, we all come back to a place of understanding just how wonderful God is.
Yes, beautiful. Thank you very much, Terry. That's lovely. Absolutely. Yeah, I love that. I love the way they come around together again, but it points back to God, doesn't it? So that whole experience for both of them, the old and the new, the bitter and the sweet, it still points back to God and how faithful and wonderful he is. Thank you, Terry. Lovely contribution. Anyone else? Yes. Ant.
Thank you. You really beautifully and gently skipped over all the naughty bits. So I'm going to go back to them.
Time, that's why.
Sorry about that.
No, that's fine.
And it's something about, and I want to pick up on what Terry said, because it's the same thing. It's the person who is new to all this, who is so absolute about it. And Ruth's commitment is so, there's nothing holding her back. I mean, and in those naughty sections, she really, she's holding nothing back. And I just wanted to reflect, and I wonder if you could reflect with us on the riskiness of being so absolute with God, that when we enter into that relationship, that there really is nothing that we're holding back. And it's a very vulnerable feeling. And perhaps that's why people who are new are more attuned to it, whereas those of us who've been in the trenches for a while are a bit sort of jaded about it and very unlikely to sort of go as absolute again with God. And how do we keep taking risks with God like that? Particularly as Christians when we're in messy situations, often of our own making.
Oh, that's a really good question. I think just from my own personal experience, when we first come to know, we first come into this family and we've received salvation and we're very excited. You have people who, they're audacious with their faith. They're very almost carefree with their faith. And God just excites them. They see God in everything, don't they? I remember when I first became a Christian, I was telling anyone and everyone about Jesus. But I think what happens to us is that over a process of time, when challenges come as Christians in the faith, when people may not respond to us positively, we get discouraged. Discouragement sets in. And when discouragement sets in, that audacity kind of goes out of the window. And I think it's a case of how do we get that back? How do we, I think it was Paul that talks about returning to our first love. How do we return to our first love, where we were infused and excited? Is like what you were saying, Terry, about the old salvation, and then we see this new salvation. And it's interesting that Naomi, in relationship with Ruth is rubbing off that passion and that joy and that childlike faith back onto Naomi. So I wonder whether it's to do with our relationships and how we find that passion. Do we find that passion in our groups, in our Christian groups? Do we find that passion in the people that we walk with? Are we walking with people who are faithful people, or are we walking with people who might have had a bad church experience and they no longer have that faith or that depth of faith, and it's rubbing off on us? So I'm asking questions now because I haven't got the answer. I wonder if anyone else could suggest, how do we keep that flame? Is that what you're saying, really? The flame alive? How do we keep that flame alive is an interesting one. And any contributions on that? Because I think it's such a good question, especially when we are going through dark, messy, and challenging situations. One person I know, a friend of mine, so I'm giving you time to think now. A friend of mine, very good friend of mine, she was in the church for so long, and she went through a really dark patch with her mental health, and she had a disease as well, a sickness as well, which meant that it was a debilitative sickness, which meant that she was experiencing a lot of pain. And one day we just didn't see her. And she wouldn't respond to any emails from the church or texts from the church, mostly texts, tried to get hold of her on WhatsApp. And she just completely stopped communication. And what happened is that because there was no communication, the church couldn't support her in her time of need. We didn't know that she was going through that time. And about a year later, she didn't want to have anything to do with church. She wasn't walking with Christians. She wasn't having fellowship or community. And she was in a really dark place. And it took her about 5 years to recover and come back to the church. So yeah, so any examples? I think we've got time. Jay.
Once again, Ruth, sorry, Grace.
You were.
You know, I can remember a very sobering comment made by an AME bishop when he was retiring at a general conference. And he spoke from the place of having been so drained of his spirituality, all the administration of the years, putting out fires of one kind or another, handling pastors and appointments, and dealing with lots of crisis. He said, I think what I want most in my retirement is to feel and know that I'm saved.
Wow.
And when he said that, I just remember like sitting on the edge of my seat, like this is a bishop. In fact, if I'm not mistaken, he was at that time the senior bishop of the AME church. And I said, for me, that like it was an earth-shifting moment, because when I came to faith, like really came to faith, I was in my teenage years, and I just felt like there was so much weight on me to walk out what I had heard over the years through my Pentecostal grandmother, through my Methodist Sunday school, through my Anglican confirmation classes. It would just wait. And when that bishop said that, I felt like God lifted an ape off my back.
Wow.
Because now it felt like, whoa, if this man who has dedicated his life to the Lord's work is feeling burdened and disconnected, and through his retirement, he feels like he can reconnect and feel and know that this faith that he's been proclaiming truly is his own. If he can say this, if he feels like this, if he needs this, oh my God, this now for me becomes, it's liberating. It's sort of like, it's freedom personified. And so now I try not to take myself too seriously. I laugh a lot. I do crazy things to, you know, all kinds of stuff around the house. My wife is always, you know, scared because she never knows what trick or crazy thing. You know, I have fun. Yeah. And I think that as Christians, especially as Christian leaders, we really need to have fun, and we need to, we need not to take ourselves so seriously. There's another point that comes to mind when you were talking about the grace of God being shown in Boaz, extending to Ruth such grace to have access to the field. Don't go over into somebody else's field. All you need is right here. Yeah. I remember in my Old Testament class, professor talked about the corners and edges of the fields. If you were poor, if you were without a kinsman redeemer, if you had hard times and you couldn't afford to go and pick from the center of the field, the grace of God through whoever the landowner or the farmer was, the grace of God extended to people of this sort was you can pick from the corners and the edges. And I saw that in Ruth, if it had not been for Boaz. Yes. I saw that in me, if it hadn't been for God's grace.
Thank you so much, Jay. Wow. Bishop Nick. And then if you follow Bishop Nick after. Thank you. Thank you, Jay. Wow. See what you started here, Canon Ant.
So I think I've not quite been like that bishop that you were speaking of, but yesterday you were talking about, you know, when you get to retirement at that transition, what you still have the gifts, but what are you going to do with it? And you mentioned yesterday the issue of mentoring, and I found that I think what keeps my faith alive and what keeps my joy alive, such as I have, is because it's that multi-generational thing of which we see exhibited between Ruth and Naomi, that you know, deliberately going out of your way to hang out with people who are of a different generation, different stage of life, being involved in, you know, there's all the admin that has to be done for sure, whatever, and there's all that other stuff that you've got to do, which just weighs you down. But actually to consciously make space for one-on-one personal discipleship, for doing evangelism, for teaching the Bible, for doing the basic things of communication and discipleship. And a Wednesday for me is the most life-giving day. It starts with a Bible study with a bunch of guys in the morning, and it ends with a Bible study online with Zoom. And I'm forced to stop what I'm doing and actually think about, well, how other people are appreciating the faith? Because you can get stuck with people like yourself, but when you're with a new Christian, or when you're with a growing Christian, or when you're with a non-Christian who's asking important questions, or when you're with a young person for whom all of the jargon makes no sense whatsoever, that's when it brings back the initial joy of the Lord. And but also you are bringing to that your own maturity, your own experience. And so it's a wonderful picture of Ruth and Naomi. They're actually blessing each other in this whole process. Naomi was willing to take Ruth. She could have said, no, like with Orpah. She could have said, no, I know you really are not coming with me, but she let her, and she introduced her to her God somehow. Yeah. So it was mutual. But I think when you're down, you need to be with somebody who's up.
Yeah, totally.
And I think that's just an important principle that it's that community that you were talking about. It's that relationship that you've been speaking about, which we need to just maintain one way or another. And also being silly around the house.
Yeah. Thank you so much for those contributions. Yeah, I think the community aspect, the relational aspect, the fellowship. So we're talking about Trinitarian values again, aren't we? So important. When someone is down, you need to be around someone who is up in their faith. And again, thank you for the mentoring aspect coming through and the teaching that brings you alive. And then Jay, you were talking about not taking yourself too seriously, you know, and reflecting. And I think it's so important to have those moments of time out in ministry where you allow yourself to reflect. And, you know, the Sabbath is really important if you have a Sabbath to do that. A Sabbath doesn't have to be the whole day. It can be an hour, it can be half a day, but taking time out to step away from ministry and being nourished again by the Spirit. And that can just be being silly. That can be having a time of mentoring with somebody who's been more established in the ministry so that things do not weigh you down. But I love the relationship. You guys are bringing this out more about Naomi, I think you said multi-generational. Naomi impacting Ruth, even though Naomi thinks she doesn't have anything to offer Ruth right from the beginning, she's stay there. She comes alive, doesn't she? Because she's imparting now. She's guiding Ruth. She's telling Ruth what to do. And she sees Ruth's passion, its impact in her own. And I love to think, I think you said it, or maybe Jay, but I'm the same with people new in the faith. They ignite my faith again because they're just so excited. And children, I teach Sunday school and young people, their questions. I love their difficult questions because it reminds me of why I became a Christian and who God is, and makes me go back and actually figure out, yeah, that's true. That's a really good question. Do I know the answer? God help me. So yes. Anyone else? I think, yep, I've forgotten your name, sorry. Jenny. There are two Jennys, aren't there? Yes, Jenny, go on.
The thing I keep thinking about is about identity. How Naomi, so I remember this so much from childhood hearing, so knowing the meaning of names was very important in the culture. Because I remember talking to my mother about the meaning of names and, you know, did she name me thinking of the meaning of a name? And she said, well, I wouldn't name you something that didn't mean something good. I don't think I would name you Mara. And we got into that conversation. But I think the thing that strikes me is she tells them to call her Mara because she's bitter, but they don't, as far as we know. And it's this thing of this identity, and you were talking about how that sweetness returns and how God has given her her identity. So even though she feels in this space where she feels bitter. And I was speaking to a friend recently who I think had lost touch with her identity. And I was reading Psalm 139 to her about being fearfully and wonderfully made. I just think that's really important, that Naomi's identity and our identity comes from God. And as a community, that we can build each other up in that, like I think her community did.
Yes.
And without meaning to take down the sort of intellectual nature of the room, the other thing that this always reminds me of, and some of you might know it, is a little story that my children, and I can't get through it without crying, is this little story called The Snoodle's Tale, made by Veggie Tales. And it's this little person who, or little creature who has his identity given to him by everyone else, sort of saying what you are. And then what happens in the end is that his identity is given back to him by God, who says, that's not what you look like at all. And so that's just the thing that keeps running through this for me, is that God giving an identity and the community sort of upholding that.
That's lovely. Thank you, Jenny. Absolutely. Identity is so important. It really does. And I'm really loving this, and how this is impacting you and how you are identifying more themes, sub-themes in this story. And identity is definitely a key one. Her identity, Naomi's identity is restored. And I think Ruth's identity is established. Because she started off with, you know, being excluded, being, there's no rights and so on. And then at the end of the story, not only is she part of the family, an Israelite, well-established family, she's in history. She goes down in history. The very, very few women written in genealogies and named in the Bible. That's who Ruth becomes. I think we've got time for maybe one more contribution. Is there anything online?
Okay. No, I wrote to Tanae and she came back and asked me, can you come what those they say.
About the idea of identity, I relate to Naomi because her identity.
Is there anything
she lost her husband, and Ruth lost her husband, and I've lost my husband. So the idea of losing your identity is something that, you know, because you're associated very much with your family and with your husband, and then when he passes, then who are you? And I just think it's lovely to see how Naomi's identity comes back through her relationship with Ruth. So I found that really helpful. The other really helpful thing I found about this was the whole issue of hope, because as a result of our loss, I think that
all right, and that's in all
my life feels very messy at the moment, but the fact of the hope that God is providentially working out the situation, it's helped. This has really helped me to remember that He is working, and I just praying that God will give me the eyes to see His hand at work providentially, because these things don't happen. You know, the Lord knows what He's doing. He's allowed all this stuff to happen, and He has given me hope that, you know, He is going to make it right, and however that looks like, and also just asking God to give me the eyes to see that. And so that's been helpful.
Thank you so much. Thank you for sharing that. And you know, he's always there, and you're right. We just need to, like Naomi, really, she started to see that over time, didn't she? She started to see God's hands. And I think as we, because the relationship is so important with God, keeping it in the times of the mess. It's so easy to be in a situation and all you see is that situation. You don't see what God sees. But that's why I think, for me personally, in my own situation, take time out in prayer and ask God, Lord, where are you in this? Show me what you see. And I know that He will do that. But it's also a time of connection, keeping the connection going with God, because He's the lifeline, right? He is our lifeline as we go through those difficult and challenging situations. We always seem to need that reassurance of our faith, and that's what the Scriptures beautifully does for us. So, but I'd love if we could pray for you at the end, if that's okay. Do we do that here?
Yeah, I do.
Thank you so much for sharing. Okay.
Well, I'll have the alarm.
Thank you.
The alarm and off, and
thank you so much for your wonderful, wonderful contributions. I am so blessed by hearing you.
Thank you. I just wanted to just say a huge thank you on behalf of all of us for what you've given. The real reason why Grace is here was not this afternoon, but who knows? This actually may be the reason why Grace is here for some of us. But she is here for tomorrow. We're graduating students, and she stands in an official capacity representing St. Mellitus College in London, which we have an affiliation with, and through which we are graduating 7 students tomorrow at 4 o'clock back here. So I hope that I know that there's some of them who are here. Lita, I'm looking at you, girl. So, yeah, and you're welcome to come back and join in that moment of celebration within the life of the church as well. I know Frances Spring is watching from online, and she's been joining us this afternoon. But we just want to say, you thought you were coming to Bermuda for a holiday. A, the weather's been atrocious. And B, as soon as the sun shines, she has to stay inside and work and to prepare 2 sermons for tomorrow, where she'll be preaching tomorrow morning and then again tomorrow afternoon. There's no rest for the Anyway, visitors, yes, thank you so much for your grace and for your love, fulfilling your name. Yes, speaking about identity. And now you're free to go your various ways, but thanks for being here. But we're going to pray. Do you want to lead us in prayer, or do you what? How are we going to do this? You think I should lead us in prayer? Thank you, Father, for your gift of grace, and thank you for your gift of life. Thank you for the reminder that we've had today of the amazing providence of your goodness and your hand at work, even in the midst of the mess of Ruth and Naomi's life and the mess of the world that we live in, the mess of our own making, the mess of the communities we live. Father, we thank you that you are the Alpha and the Omega, the beginning and the end, and that nothing takes you by surprise. Help us, Father, to work out how we in our own day and time, in our own experience, can have a renewal of that joy, a renewal of that assurance, a renewal of a knowledge of your presence and your purposes for each one of us. Lord, each one of us today brings difficult experiences, difficult times, wondering where you are, wondering what the point is, wondering how to cope. But Lord, this story has reminded us of the power of your love, the power of relationship and community, the power of hope that comes through the grace of the gospel. Father, thank you for that reminder today. Thank you for Grace, who shared that with us, and I pray you continually give her strength. We do pray for a daughter who's going to be going off to England tonight, and I pray, Father, for safety and travel for her. And I pray, Lord, that you would surround each one of us with that tremendous sense of your purpose. And we pray these things in Jesus' name. Amen.